people disappearing, bodies turning up in horrific conditions, and reports of a creature so terrifying it made the residents of an Alaskan village abandon everything they had, leaving behind a ghost town known as the town of Portlock. And today, I'll cover why this village was abandoned, not once or twice, but 4 separate times. Unlike most ghost towns in America, Portlock has been settled by at least 4 different peoples across centuries, only to be abandoned under mysterious circumstances each time. The first known record of someone reaching Portlock was of British Captain Nathaniel Portlock, which solves the mystery of how the place got its name. Portlock arrived in 1785 and started surveying a land strip by the bay, and basically everywhere, and that's when he discovered something uncanny. He discovered ample remnants of a native village. This confused Portlock's crew because the area was full of untouched game and had plenty of fish to sustain the village. So why did the previous settlers leave? Whatever their reasons, the fact was that the natives had left behind a prime area and Portlock's crew was going to settle there. Or so they thought. Soon, members of the crew started getting sick, and it was no ordinary sickness. It came with waves of fear. Terrified and weakened with sickness, the crew began to beg Portlock to leave. Portlock listened to his men and left the area, which would eventually be named after him. What Portlock did not know was that his crew wasn't the first to reach that bay. Just 6 years before him, Spanish explorers had reached the same strip of land and decided to settle there. They too were similarly confused to find that natives had abandoned such a prime area with so many opportunities to hunt and fish. But just like Portlock's crew, the Spanish explorers also started feeling sick. Some died, and those who managed to survive lived in fear of whatever had driven the original natives out. They could hear horrible and morose cries from the forest. The sounds would get closer to them, ever so slowly. Then, one day, the Spanish explorers decided to pack up and leave, just like the original settlers. And now, 6 years later, British Captain Nathaniel Portlock had made a similar decision. Portlock's crew had survived in colder climates, and the Spanish explorers had seen harsher conditions. But when it came to Portlock, neither the persistent settlers nor the motivated explorers could stay for long. So what was this special sickness that came with waves of fear and eventually pushed both crews to flee such a prime area? One explanation is infrasound, which is a low-pitched frequency that some mammals produce. Humans can't hear it, but can feel its effects. It can cause nausea, vomiting, and vertigo, all consistent with the symptoms experienced by Portlock's men. But things get even more terrifying when you realize who produces infrasound. Predators like tigers have been known to produce infrasound to stun and disorient their prey. It is believed that sperm whales also use sound frequencies to terrify their prey into stillness before hunting them. If Portlock's men were indeed getting sick because of infrasound, they were lucky to have left when they did, because those who came after were unfortunate enough to find that the predator of Portlock was not a tiger, but something much more terrifying. For more than 80 years, Portlock remained a ghost town. Then, in 1867, a community of nomadic Sugpiaq set up camp in the bay of what is modern-day Portlock. They were grateful for all the food they could easily access in the area. Plenty of large clams and easy-to-catch fish, moose, which the natives had hunted for thousands of years. If they settled there, they would never be without food. So they settled and they celebrated, but not for long. Within a month, the Sugpiaq settlers were attacked, but the attackers didn't want their fish or food. The attackers wanted them. The Sugpiaq described the attackers as cannibal giants who began raiding their village. Sometimes the raids would happen every night, and the giants displayed animalistic savagery that the Sugpiaq had never encountered before. Initially, the natives fought to keep their new home, but the attacks kept happening. Whenever there was more game to hunt in the forest, the giants would stop attacking. But just as the villagers thought the danger was no more, the giants would return, seeking human flesh. Whenever there were fewer animals to hunt in the forest, the giants started attacking the village more frequently. So it's not surprising that the Sugpiaq left the village. But they took with them stories of the man-eating giants and their horrifying raids. This happened in 1905, after which Portlock would remain abandoned until 1921, when a nomadic community of Russian Alutiiq tried to settle the bay. But unlike the previous settlers, the Alutiiq brought 20th century industry with them. They set up a cannery to process salmon, which was abundant and easy to catch in the area. They also built a post office and a school, alongside other institutions to turn Portlock into a 20th century town. But Portlock was no ordinary town. The Alutiiq shared ancestry with the Sugpiaq, who had fled the area 16 years ago, so they had heard the stories about the raids from what the Sugpiaq called the Nantinak. According to some translations, it means half man, half beast, and according to others, Nantinak translates to giant hairy thing. Whatever it was, the Alutiiq did not want to come across it, so they quickly implemented strict rules, starting with a curfew at night. They also had armed guards to protect the schools and the cannery, and guards who would even patrol the streets, which is perhaps the reason why the town was pretty safe, at least initially. Or perhaps it was safe for another reason. The Alutiiq never ever went out in the fog or the forest. They had heard the stories of what lurked in the forest, and they did not want to disturb it. During foggy days, they could hear the Nantinak prowling the town's streets, but since no one was outside, it would leave without incident. The rules helped the Alutiiq survive in an area where no one before them could, and the town thrived without incident for about a decade. Then, something shook the town of Portlock to its core. By 1930, the Alutiiq community had grown bigger and was more successful, so they started getting overconfident. They let their guard down and got lax with their rules. And just a year later, they would realize why that was a mistake. In 1931, a logger named Andrew Comlock went into the forest to chop down a tree. Previously, all logging work was limited to the edge of the forest. But Comlock had gone deeper, and when he did not return, his friends formed a search party and followed his footsteps. They found Comlock, but not in the condition they hoped. The logger's head was caved in with the log-moving sled, which was obviously too heavy for any human to lift. Comlock's dogs, who had been dragging the sled, were found torn to shreds, and the sled itself seemed to have been flung far away from Comlock and his dogs. Comlock's friends were terrified, and rightly so, because they didn't even know what to think of what they had witnessed, and for a while, nobody knew what to make of it, until one fateful day. Another resident, Tom Larson, went to chop wood for fish traps, and that's when he saw a large, terrifying, hairy creature on the beach. It was standing like a human, but was too large and furry to be one. For some strange reason, Larson ran home and returned with a rifle. He had the creature in his sights, ready to pull the trigger. The creature turned around and stared at him. Despite his finger on the trigger, Larson could not explain why he never fired. But his account helped others understand what happened to Comlock. The Alutiiq weren't surprised by the existence of a large humanoid creature. What concerned them was how bold the creature was getting. Not only was it venturing out in the open, but it was also targeting humans. Soon after Comlock's body was discovered, more Portlock residents started disappearing. It seemed like Comlock had agitated something in the forest, and now it was out for revenge. And that's not hard to believe. Tigers, elephants, and even crows are known to be vengeful. One tiger is reported to have spent a whole year preventing a hunter from hunting after he stole the tiger's kill. The tiger went on to destroy most of his traps and would roar and scare away any animals that would come near the remaining traps. It seemed like the Nantinak had a similarly vengeful spirit. First, a few gold prospectors vanished. but people assumed they were on extended prospecting trips. Then, a group of hunters disappeared. Again, people dismissed it as an extended hunting trip. But a clear pattern was emerging. Each disappearance was getting a little closer to the town. It would seem like something was moving in on the Alutiiq, but the people did not attribute the disappearances to the Nantinak until bodies started turning up. Some bodies would wash up in the bay with claw and bite marks. Others would be mauled beyond recognition. The Alutiiq were terrified and went back to their original rules, but nothing would stop the creature that had developed a liking for human flesh. While most Alutiiq had started attributing the deaths to the Nantinak, some skeptics still assumed that the attacker could be a very intelligent bear. Then, one day, they found a body that would turn even the most skeptical Alutiiq into firm believers of the Nantinak. The body seemed to have been swept down the mountain by spring rains. It was torn and dismembered in a way no bear was capable of. The Alutiiq started getting stricter about going out and started posting more guards, but nothing could stop the force of nature that was snatching and mauling residents. Up to 36 bodies had turned up along trails, rivers, and in the bay, all grossly mangled beyond recognition. And many bodies never turned up. People would go missing and stay missing. According to official reports, 15 people were reported missing during this time. The Alutiiq disagree and say that the number is far higher. They also emphasize that the way the bodies were mutilated was unlike anything a bear or a wolf could or would do. At one point, the cannery workers collectively refused to come to work. They said that they were scared of whatever was prowling in the woods. They were begged to return the following season with promises of around-the-clock protection from armored guards. The Alutiiq tried their best to continue living in Portlock, but the death toll just kept rising. So eventually, they left. But the way they left was pretty strange. In 1950, almost overnight, everyone except a post office worker abandoned the town. It was like they were trying to trick a highly intelligent predator. One day, the Alutiiq seemed to be going about their business, and the next, they all left. But they left someone behind. A post office worker virtually barricaded himself in the Portlock post office. He reported hearing the sounds of a heavy two-legged creature roaming the empty streets of the freshly abandoned village. Fortunately for him, the post office closed, and he too left Portlock. By 1951, Portlock's population was 0. One would think that the stories would end. Whatever creature had been spitefully targeting the Alutiiq would go back to living its life, but instead, it seems like the creature had developed an appetite for human blood. Roughly 18 years after the abandonment of Portlock, a hunter ventured into the forest near the ghost town. He was looking for wild goats, but what he found instead gave him nightmares for years to come. At first, he felt like someone was stalking him. He heard slow footsteps and distant rustling. But then, within seconds, the footsteps sped up. He wasn't being stalked. He was being chased. He started running and never looked back. The creature chasing him was screaming and making horrendous sounds, and it kept following him until he was out of the forest. 5 years later, in 1973, 3 hunters were passing by Portlock when a storm forced them to take shelter in the abandoned town. They could not sleep the entire night because something kept circling their camp. It kept growling and uttering sounds that were unintelligible but threatening, and each hunter swore that the thing walked on 2 feet. The walking on 2 feet aspect is something that another group of hunters also brought up. They were tracking a moose when they noticed man-like footprints that were over 18 inches long. The hunters realized that the creature was also tracking the same moose. Then, they came across an area where the grass was flattened. It seemed like something had wrestled the moose, and it was clear who had won. The moose tracks did not go beyond the grass, while the giant man-like footprints continued upward into the mountains. Considering the size of a moose, it's clear that whatever those man-like footprints belonged to was no man. One of the most recent accounts is from 1990, when an Anchorage paramedic was called to aid someone who was incarcerated in the Eagle River Jail. The inmate, who had suffered a heart attack, was a 70-year-old Alutiiq. He was limp and silent, so the paramedic tried to engage him by telling him about his adventures. The inmate remained unresponsive until the paramedic mentioned that he had gone hunting in the forests around Portlock. The elderly man sprang up and grabbed the medic by the shirt. "Did you see it? Did it bother you?" he asked as guards rushed in. "Did you see it? Did it bother you?" he repeated while looking terrified. As the guards took him away, he kept asking over and over, "Did you see it? Did it bother you?" While it makes for a very compelling story, Portlock's predator is not the only explanation for Portlock's misfortune. In fact, there are alternative explanations for every strange occurrence in the now abandoned town. All the semi-shredded bodies that the Alutiiq attributed to the Nantinak could be the result of bear attacks, and bears are known to stand on their feet. The natives said it wasn't something a bear would do, but that's just their opinion. It is possible for a bear to be more ferocious than the Alutiiq estimated. Bears are notorious for venturing into forest-edge towns at night and on foggy days. It is possible that the Alutiiq elders made stories to keep the children indoors during these times. The same children have grown up and told us all we know about what happened in Portlock. As for Comlock being found with his head caved in, that could be a logging accident. He could have hit his head on a tree branch while sledding, but he wasn't near a bloody tree branch or even his own sled. Perhaps he had a seizure. Sometimes people can hit their heads and start walking because of a seizure. This makes them move several feet without being conscious. A very public case of this was when Saudi soccer player Abdul Rahman al-Shoabi got kicked in the neck and had a seizure where he immediately stood up and started moving. Only after he kept falling and getting up did others notice that something was wrong. Shoabi survived, but Comlock did not. But what about his dogs? They were torn to shreds, and that could not have been an accident. The explanation here is again, bears. A bear attack could explain why the dogs were ripped apart, but Comlock's body was mostly intact, because he was dead, and bears usually go after live prey. The combination of an accidental hit to the head, followed by a seizure and a bear attack, would explain what happened to Comlock and his dogs. It would require a lot of coincidences, though. As for the 15 to 30 people that vanished in Portlock, that could be chalked up to the risky professions they had. They were either fishermen navigating frigid waters or hunters and loggers venturing into a forest inhabited by two species of bears. Their bodies turning up torn to shreds could also be attributed to bears. Sure, the locals said that a bear could never do that, but maybe they had never really seen what a bear could do. By the 1950s, the Nantinak myth had escaped the confines of the Alutiiq community and spread throughout Alaska. So every account of being stalked by two-legged creatures since then can be chalked up to willful hallucinations and made-up stories. This explanation works if you really want to believe it, but you have to ignore a lot of things, like the time when the Alutiiq found dozens of trees completely uprooted and driven into the ground upside down. You could attribute that to a weird hurricane. These are what critics are saying, and you can see that in a way it's true. But this is where things start getting shaky, and this is also my personal opinion. There are nearly 140,000 bears in Alaska, and many inhabit forests near towns and villages. Never has a bear been a big enough threat to make a community disappear overnight. So how can the Alutiiq exodus from Portlock be attributed to a bunch of bears? Killing a bear that is endangering your life or property is legal in Alaska. So why didn't the Alutiiq form a hunting party and get rid of the bear instead of leaving everything behind? It would certainly be more practical to do that. Here's where things get interesting. An Alutiiq named Sally Ash came forward and said that there were no killings and that there was nothing to look at in Portlock. But the more she tried to downplay what happened, the more it looked like she was trying to hide something. They moved because of the economy, schools, and the church, Ash told a reporter. This checks out with the timeline of the regional development. There were indeed better opportunities in Nanwalek and Seldovia, where the Alutiiq moved. Ash's explanation would have been accepted by everyone if it were not for her cousin, Melania Kell. Kell was the first to break the story of the Nantinnaq to the press in a 2009 Homer Tribune interview. Kell told the interviewer that her people left the town because the Nantinnaq was killing people. Sally Ash was Kell's translator during that interview, and though she helped communicate Kell's story to the public, she does not support it herself. 12 years after Kell's original interview, Sally Ash told the reporter that there really was no killing of people, but she didn't deny the existence of the Nantinnaq. People would see Nantinnaq, explained Ash, but that wasn't the reason why people moved this way to Seldovia and Nanwalek. This explanation creates more questions than it answers. If Sally Ash is right and the Nantinnaq is just a harmless recluse, why did her ancestors have such strict rules against going out, especially when it was foggy? Why is it that Ash herself admits that when they go through that area, even today, they are careful not to make waves and be noisy? If the creature never harmed anyone, how did the Alutiiq learn to keep their distance from it? What if it wasn't a bear? What if it was a giant, like those found in the Solomon Islands? This is a video we did of giants found in the Solomon Islands, and I can't help but see the similarities in characteristics between the two creatures. Could the creatures of Portlock be the same as the creatures of the Solomon Islands? And if it is, what does that even mean?